Eastover is one neighborhood that the whole neighborhood is Eastover minus one street. And that one street is a Fayetteville street.
Well, Gates 4, the whole new section of Gates 4 is in the city. Everything else is not.
Right.
So you have vastly different taxes
Right.
in that,
in the same neighborhood.
in the same neighborhood. So these are things you've got to know. You know, you're the realtor, you better know. So. All right.
Keep us on our toes, right?
That's right.
Just when you feel like you're getting it down.
There's no such thing. There's no such thing. You're like, what? So the thing is, you just have to pay attention. And it used to be, you just had to read the newspaper. Oh.
And the commission said you have a duty to know. It's like, yeah, I knew last week. This week is a whole different story.
But then they'll say, this has been this for how long?
Right,
You
right.
know?
It's been proposed for.
Yeah. All right. All right, it is 11 o'clock.
Awesome.
This will not take that long, but it's super important. So these disclosures that we're going over, I mean, these addendums that we're going over, Shelby took all of them and added them to DocuSign yesterday, but it's not like as simple as you all adding something. It has to go to DocuSign. They put it in our folder. So I'm not sure if it's there yet or not, but they're all labeled. And so here's the first one. Don't see this much at all. This is because the market is slowing down a little bit. This is if your buyer was desperate and really wanted to pay part of the seller's expenses. This is how you would put it in there. And this is, so parties agree that here buyer agrees to pay up to, and then you would change that 350 or just leave it towards the preparation of the seller's deed. Buyer agrees to pay the county excise, and it tells you exactly what that is. And then and any administrative fees. So they basically agreed to pay everything but the commission, because in a VA finance loan, they cannot pay your commission. So side note, if you have them for sale by owner and they're like, hey, I'm not paying any commission, you're doing it for free. Unless your buyer, and because they can't pay it. So you better try to negotiate them to do something. You don't want to do it outside, get paid outside of closing, because that's, yes, that's against the rules. Don't want you to do that. So that's that one. If it was beneficial, or you thought, you know, your buyer, say it's a 120, 130, you know, the price range is just going insane, you know, and you want to add something else to make it good, appealing to your buyer, use this. I mean, to the seller. I always forget to turn the Zoom people's noise on. All right. Just in time. Hello, Geraldo. ¿Cómo estás?
Bien, bien. Quick question. But can you explain the last sentence there? Buyer has agreed to pay administrative fees. That one.
Buyer agrees to pay any administrative fee charged by the buyer's selected settlement agent to sellers relating to the payoff and cancellation. So, you know, you see on the you see on your CD that the attorney has charged, you know, whatever fee that is. It wouldn't be very much, like a $50 flood cert, these kind of fees. These are administrative fees. And cancellation of the mortgage, they may pay a recording fee there. Those fees, those are all the seller fees. Look on your, you look on a CD and see what they are. They're not going to come to a great deal, but you need to go ahead and check it and make sure that with your buyer, if you're offering this, that you have covered it all so that your buyer knows what it is. Does that make sense?
Can this be modified to like make it like option 1 be this whole section, option 2 and a specific amount?
Everything can be modified, But if you modify this, ask Ashish to do it because you would be acting as an attorney.
Well, that's what I was talking about. If you could ask Ashish to make it, to do a new one.
You could, but
Okay.
I wouldn't have him just do one now because these are not the market is slowing down a little bit. If you have a specific one that you want him to do it, send him this and say what you want done. But this is
Thank you.
just another option of your addendums that make your offer a little more appealing. And the idea is to make it as specific as possible so that you know what you have just committed your buyer to. And so the seller also knows, oh, look, we're not gonna have to pay the excise tax. Or we're getting $350 paid of our seller side legal fees. Oh, and we're also getting this paid. So you'll know and they'll know. And the way they would know specifically is if you do the seller net, the estimated net for every offer. A lot of times I just see the same one put back in and it's already accepted at this point. Okay, but the idea is always to communicate to your client what's going on. And so they have a very good idea of what it is. And I would encourage you to always overestimate at the beginning and horrify them then, and not shock them at closing when they're like, well, wait a minute, this isn't what you said. I don't want, and it goes for both, for buyers' expenses and for seller. You want them, if you're the buyer, you want to prepare them to bring more money than what they're actually gonna have to bring, rather than not converse. Because that could, I got an agent called me a couple days ago. My buyer is $1,600 short to buy this house. Well, how did this happen? Like, how did you not discuss this? Did you not do, do they not have your good faith estimate from the lender that tells you what all they're going to need to bring? Where was the breakdown? Because you are responsible for letting them know, hey, you're gonna have to bring this much money. If you're doing an FHA, you're bringing 3.5% down, plus you're bringing the closing expenses. Plus, if you agreed to something like that, you better add that all up and say, do you have $12,000? Because it's a strange phenomenon. A few years ago, no buyers in Cumberland County had any money. Like no money, didn't they? Like none. Oh, I have to put $200 of earnest money and another $250 for due diligence. I don't know where I'm gonna come up with that. And now, like I said, I just approved a file was $20,000 of due diligence. So, all right, so we're gonna go to the next one. Another strange phenomenon that's happening. Sight unseen buyers. You better have this. You better protect yourself. I don't care if you videoed into every cabinet. You better have them sign this as well. Because it's all about them, UCYA, and them making sure that they know they're taking the responsibility, they're taking this risk, And if they're buying it sight unseen, when you do your video and everything, you should do the street into it. You should stand outside, not just the house, even so much as the way there. But if there's something that you wouldn't like on the way, maybe you show them that, so, and then have them sign this that they're okay with it. Because we had one, she, I don't care, blah, 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 super cheap house. I don't care if it's a bad neighborhood. The buyer's like, hey, the house isn't clean. I mean, the buyer's agent's like, house isn't clean, send her pictures. Oh, I don't care. You should come to walkthrough before it's closing. I don't care, I'm good. Sign everything. oh my God, this house is a mess. You were told, you were told, you were told, and it didn't matter. She didn't have this, you know, and it became a cluster, right? So you've got to constantly protect yourself. I don't want to sound like, did anybody go to school with Terry Farr? Yeah, so you know what I'm talking about. He's like, well, I have a cash check. That was his favorite thing to say, you know, that you came out of real estate school and you're just sure you're going to be sued on your first deal, right? He's like, well, I have a cash check. I don't want to sound like that, but there are reasons that we have these addendums and these disclosures.
Trisha, this just popped into my head. This is strictly for buyer's agent protection, correct? It doesn't need to be sent when you have a sight unseen sale to the listing agent with the offer, correct?
No, this is just for the buyer.
Okay, all right.
Because
Is
that's
there something?
their problem,
Okay,
you know, like they wouldn't be going after the listing agent if it was a sight unseen. That's the buyer's agent.
yeah, I had a
responsibility.
listing agent ask me, you know, say that she didn't know it was sight unseen because there wasn't a sight unseen addendum with the offer. And I was like, well, I didn't think I needed one.
You don't have to have one.
Where do I find this?
This is all going to be in DocuSign. Shelby put it in yesterday. However, it takes a minute for DocuSign to put it in our regular documents.
Okay.
It's not an instant upload.
It'll be a KW.
It'll be under the KW form.
Is there any way that she can send the actual PDFs to everybody as well?
No, you don't. You need to learn how to use the damn document.
But I'd like to use this.
Why are you going to create more work for Shelby? They're all right here. You can grab them.
Question. If we're already, since it doesn't need to go to the seller's agent, is this something that would be okay to be filled out after you're already under contract, or does it have to be?
You could just, do you have a buyer that bought something sight unseen? Yeah, I would go ahead and send this to them.
Okay,
But clearly they're supposed, are they still in their due diligence?
yeah,
Yeah, then fine, send it.
okay.
Yep. All right. I sold one many years ago, sight unseen, and that was extremely nerve-wracking. You know, I was just like, but back then, you showed them multiple houses and they could actually go back home without something under contract. And I had shown them so many houses, I knew exactly what they were looking for. And when it came on the market, I was like, oh my gosh, here's your house. And they're like, you're right, that is. And it was just pictures. But let me tell you what, I was nervous until they actually walked through it and were like, we love it. I was like, oh. Because, you know, that's a lot. It's a lot. All right, due diligence fee delay. So in the contract, your due diligence is supposed to be delivered with the accepted offer, right? The house is still under contract as long as everybody's signed. Don't let some listing agent tell you, well, we don't have a contract, but you haven't delivered the money. Tell them to look on page, I think it's 14 of the contract, and it specifically says the validity of this contract have nothing to do with the delivery of money. So you are under contract. Your due diligence money is supposed to be there right away. If you're the selling agent and they still haven't gotten it because it's being mailed from Qatar or something, you have to, in writing, and an email works, you have to say, hey, I want, here's the demand for it. I want it in 24 hours and the house is going back on the market. Or if you are the buyer and you know that they've come to town and they don't, or they're just buying this sight unseen from wherever and it's going to take a minute to get the money, go ahead and let them know right here. She's just drawn up a nice little addendum that says what time frame you're going to get it there. So that. And it gives you, you know, how many days of the effective date of the contract to get it. So you might as well, like anything, communication is key. If you tell the seller, hey, it's gonna maybe take me a week to get the due diligence fee here to you, and they already know it, and they've agreed to it, the listing agent is not calling you constantly and me saying they haven't delivered the money, you know, do you understand the contract, it's due, blah, 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 you know how it goes. Just tell them, like, hey, they're out of town. It's gonna come, they're gonna send it.
So I'm reading this, it says that both parties agree that homeboy's out of town and it's gonna take until this many days to receive it. And it also says the parties that if the buyer terminates buyer before the delayed effective date, the buyer shall not be obligated to pay the due diligence fee.
That would
Right.
be.
Which is the same thing, if you haven't delivered it anyway, they're not obligated to it.
Well, they are under the new contract.
Yeah.
But but if you don't have it, they'd have to come after you later.
So we're under the new contract, the buyer doesn't have the opportunity to terminate without the delivery of the due diligence money. The due diligence money delivery is required regardless if they terminate or not, and whoever has it. So are we able to get it? Likely not. The seller has the opportunity to take it to court and
Sure,
and press and get that for, you know, for the money.
right, so
and then
what
like they
this
win.
is doing is talking about that, hey, if they don't get it and they terminate it, it's eliminating that fight as well. You know, so maybe you don't say, maybe you don't take it, or you scratch it out, you know, but it's all about like, hey, if they don't get it, right, so court, it's the same thing, if you've got it and you haven't delivered it and your buyer says, give it back to me, you have to give it back, you know, and then they have to go and sue for it.
So
We have that
was
right
the-
now.
That was the case,
Prior to the new contract?
but with the new contract, I mean, I know it's not hard to pay, he already said that that's what it was.
It's
That
not
was
terminated.
also prior to the.
The
new
2021
contract.
changes.
Correct, so how does that change?
If the buyer is not, the buyer cannot terminate, he can sign any document he wants. They're still under contract until the due diligence money is delivered. At that point,
Mhm.
they can terminate.
But is the seller also gonna wanna wait
Right, so
for
that,
that on the market?
so-
With due diligence fees, they might want to
I was
for
gonna say,
$20,000.
the diligence fee is. I mean,
right, but so it just opens up a whole nother, you know, so like what Joanna said, or like, okay, so they've just decided not to terminate, they haven't given the money. How are you gonna get it from them? You're gonna
And
have
then
to
also,
sue?
okay, so is there also an earnest money deposit in there as well? Because the longer that they prolong this, now they could also be liable for earnest money as well.
True, they
For,
could,
for damages if they go to terminate.
they could, unless they terminated, if it's a VA offer and they terminated during the due diligence, there's no,
They would have to deliver the due diligence in order to terminate it, so they don't have to pay the earnest money deposit.
supposedly. But here's the thing, get your buyer to deliver any money
Well, yeah.
when they've delivered,
Yeah.
so.
But if
But
we're gonna
then-
explain the contract to the buyer, they need to understand that you cannot terminate
You,
unless you deliver the due
Right.
diligence money.
you are still responsible for it.
And as a
Regardless.
listing agent, I'm not at all advising my seller to take this document,
No,
you know? So,
well, you're kind of hoping that as if you're the buyer's agent, you're putting this out there. You're hoping the listing agent doesn't read it or doesn't understand it.
yeah, in a competitive market. like,
Which,
I wouldn't.
you know, like we can laugh, but it's it's true,
Yeah.
right? It's very true. All of these are slighted for whatever side you're working on. You know, like,
Absolutely.
I know she has his dad's house or something. And he's like, no, we are not accepting any of those appraisal addendums, none of them.
And he will-
Then he wrote, right, exactly, then he wrote. He's like, no, let the chips fall where they may
Well, and I know the
and go
market-
with the contract.
I know people are saying the market's softening up. I haven't experienced that, but that, even if they offered more and a giant appraisal gap and that comes along with it, I would advise my sellers against it. So it's putting your buyers at disadvantage because you're trying to protect them too much in this market,
Right.
you know? Something to
Well,
consider.
but you've got a buyer who's like, I really want it, and I'm gonna put $10,000 out, and if it falls through, they can't buy anything,
Yeah.
you know?
Mhm.
They're done. Yeah, so what then? You know, so I feel bad for that buyer, right?
Mm.
You know, and yet, if you're working for the seller, that's who you're going to. So read everything from the seat that you're sitting in at the time, right?
Right.
Always. And then you might want to say, for example, okay, so this one, it's expressly agreed that notwithstanding any other provision, the buyer shall not incur any penalty, right? So say it's a VA buyer and it's a $10,000 due diligence. They're gonna get their due diligence back if the appraisal comes back crazy low and the seller is like, no, we're not gonna sell it. And it could, because some sellers have it in their mind that their $200,000 house is now worth $250,000 because that's what their friend got up in DC. And no matter what you explain to them that the market is local, doesn't matter, right? They're like, they've got it in their head, and their agent said, okay, well, I'll put it, we can see, right? Which is, if you do that, you make them sign a market analysis and maybe even state that it is against my judgment and my professional opinion that the house is listed at this price. Have them sign it. Because we had, years ago, it's completely different, but Help You Sell, I think was the name of it, or Seller, you pay $550 and put the house on the market. And they put it in the MLS.
Click it, help you sell.
It's something like that.
There's several. Steven Stoop's doing it now, and there's another one.
There was a woman, she lived in Kings Grant, she did it. Anyway,
No.
she let the people just choose the price. She lost her license because of it. Because she was acting like a real estate agent, but not providing the information and the guidance. I forget exactly what the verbiage was, but that's what it was, like, So if you're going to go grossly off of what you professionally believe is what the house should sell for, you need to document that and say, hey, we did this. So they say it's 250, right? Then the appraisal comes back, right where you told them, 200. The appraisal gap addendum might be 10,000. They're gonna get 210. And they're like, no way in hell, I'm not selling the house. My house is worth 250. That agent, the appraiser, everybody's crazy. Either they come up with the $40,000. I'm gonna take that 10,000 of due diligence and put it back on the market. It is an avenue for sellers, if they want to make some cash. And what do they care if they just took $10,000? So how do you justify to the real estate commission who they've received a complaint from a buyer, that, hey, this was way overpriced and they took my money? So just make sure you can. And is that what you want to do? So the other thing you could do here, if it's like 10,000, 20,000, maybe you split it if it's a VA, or anything like, hey, put some as due diligence and some as earnest money. So it's not as devastating to that poor buyer if they end up if the seller decides not to sell the house, right? But you explain it all, your offer comes in with this, you've got the seller, you've told them every scenario, they're like, no, we want that due diligence money. You then have to either scratch it out here or tell them, no, use an we don't want an appraisal. We want one with no return. This one says, okay, so this one says, shall not incur any penalty by forfeiture of earnest money due diligence. And I like that, like due diligence is second on there, right? So you're kind of going with the fact that the seller's agent, the listing agent may not read that, you know? So, okay, good. You're gonna get the due diligence back. This one says, let's just eliminate that argument right now. And it says, it is expressly agreed that the buyer shall not be entitled to the return of the due diligence fee. If you have a VA buyer and they're using the VA financing addendum, you don't need that, because if they have just the VA addendum, they're not getting their due diligence back. They'll get the earnest money back, but they're not going to get the due diligence. Here they're going to get, they're not getting anything, and they're going and stating it right up front. So if you have a buyer and it really doesn't matter. Some buyers, it does, $500 is huge to them, you know. You have got to explain this. We had one this weekend. They had a $10,000 due diligence, and it's a VA buyer. And I was talking to the woman, and she's like, well, if it doesn't appraise, I get my $10,000 back if they decide not to sell it. And I'm like, no, you don't. She's like, well, my agent said I did.
Oh, hi.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of our agents. Hence this class. Yeah.
We text them.
Hopefully the agent is in this process.
Yeah, we shall.
Oh.
So again, your job is to educate your client, either be it the buyer or the seller. And what you say, what you recommend, you know, depends on what side of that table you're sitting on. And you explain that to them as well, like, hey, you know, this is what you could do. This is what you want to do. This is what you would want done to you, you know, like, so read the addendums. And even if they're not going, your people are like, hey, I don't want to pay any over the appraisal price. You explain to them, okay, but if you've got due diligence money in there and it doesn't come back at the price, the appraised value, and the seller decides to walk away, your due diligence money is walking away as well. So maybe you want to put in a small amount just to throw this addendum on. Or you could put none, but then, and it's just like you're going to get your due diligence fee back, right? But I am not seeing these appraisal addendums nearly as crazy as they were. Right now they're like 1,000, 2,000. So it seems a little more realistic, because when you go to be, and when you're that seller in 3 years, this will be very interesting to see what happens. So we'll be back to nobody has any money. Be back to a $250 due diligence fee, which was normal. I've seen $500 earnest money. Very common there for a while. All right, those are them, or they. So they're there for you to fill out, or they will be. And we can have, you know, them email to.
So is it okay if, like, we get an offer from the buyer's side to send them our addendums to fill out instead?
You can.
Okay, I did that, and I guess I should have asked
Oh, no, it doesn't matter. It
Okay,
doesn't matter at
so
all.
just-
They're not proprietary to us at all. So, yeah, no, that's fine. And it's not a bad idea.
I just
because
posted our words and then.
you'll see, in additional provisions where it says repairs, people will write this.
I know.
Bad idea. Very bad idea. Like, you need it specifically laid out. You'll see an addendum that says buyer agrees to pay $100,000 regardless of appraisal value. Whoa. Do you realize what you're opening your buyer up to there? You know, so don't do that. Be very specific. This is a big deal. This is a legal binding document. They are buying, this is the biggest purchase of people's lives. Pay attention to it and make sure you protect them. And have them, I think part of the reason people aren't as informed is with COVID, you're not driving them around. You know, I drove all my buyers around in the car, right? Many of them, I'd have them a job by the time I had them a house, you know, like I knew everything about them. I'm like, oh, you need this, you need this, you need to go here, you know, blah, blah, blah. If you're not in the car with them, I don't think you have nearly the relationship that you do if you're just walking in and saying, well, what do you think about this house? Okay, follow me to the next one. You know, you get, and if they're in the car with you, you are discussing legal contracts, all of this, you know, I don't think it's nearly enough to say, okay, well, I'm gonna write the offer and I'll send it to you. If you have any questions, call me. They're not gonna call you. They just clickety click, 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 click through. And then they're like, oh, well, if it doesn't appraise, I'll get my $10,000 back. No, you won't. And explain that. You know, explain that to a buyer. How would you like that if that happened to you and you just lost $10,000? How would you feel?
I actually made a little PDF of the upfront costs and terms associated with an offer,
Mhm.
and I give it to every buyer during a consult, to make them understand that unless the seller reaches the contract, it's gone, you know, or we have some sort of.
That's smart. That is very smart.
Buyers are just desperate now. They'll throw the numbers out there to win the bid, and then when it comes down to it, they're like, oh.
Right. So the next question is, you don't think you would have to have it is, okay, you're agreed to this amount of money. Do you have it?
Right.
Do you have that money? Okay, I mean, because it seems logical. If you just agree to pay it,
Mhm.
why the hell would you agree to pay it if you don't have it? Well, you want to get the house.
Mhm.
I just had that happen to me.
Did you? What happened?
He got the money. Oh, I mean, he was an officer, Army guy, officer, single, transferring $1,500 in DD money. He's like, oh, I can't put that on a credit card. I was like, dude, you don't have $1,500? Commissioned officer, United States Army? No. He went and Ubered and stuff and got it over the weekend.
Listen, at least he did.
Yeah.
Yeah, like,
I was like, I never even thought, I was like,
well, there's so many things.
which I normally do, and then you get to the one where it's like, oh, yeah. it's
Yeah.
slam dunk.
I know your pay grade. I know
Yeah,
your
you're up in
pay
Virginia
grade.
getting $1,700 a month and
Right,
BAH,
yeah,
too easy.
just save it.
My girl takes that money.
Well, that's like, I had a foreclosure one time and I was like, I had to call, one of the jobs I had to do was, you had to make people, you had to determine occupancy. So I'd go to the door and see who was there. And the guy answers the door and I'm like, you know, I'm sure you're aware your house is in foreclosure. He's like, yeah. My wife handles all that. I'm like, well, he's like, oh, and I've been in Haiti because I was when the earthquake years ago that we all sent people through. And I'm like, oh, I'm sorry. You know, he's like, and then I got shot. And I said, oh my gosh, you got shot in Haiti? And he's like, no, my wife shot me. And I was like, where is she? Because, you know, it's a little sketchy, this particular part of doing foreclosure. So I had my daughter in the car and I'm like, hey, if something happens, first of all, don't ever tell your dad. Secondly, you watch the door, and if I don't, if something happens, you call 911, and I'm like, don't ever tell Dad. But he said she wasn't there. So, yeah, I mean, you just never know. What we would assume is just a very logical part of the whole thing, like, don't agree to pay it if you don't have the money, so it's kind of like at closing, when the attorney says, so Courtney, you're married and you're married to each other, right? It seems like a logical question, that that second part is there for a reason.
Not always.
Yeah, exactly. I had one guy who's like, well, I'm kind of married. I was like, well, that's kind of like being pregnant. There's no such thing. You either are or you're not. And he's like, I got married on the internet. Oh, okay. To a person? She exists. We need her. So anyway. Did you have a question,
I was
Jay?
gonna comment on the price list thing. I actually created an Excel spreadsheet where you can plug and play numbers to kind of help buyers see, well, if I offered this much and I want my lender to give me 5% down payment or 20%, you can change the percentages to kind of show this is what you need for the closing. Inspection costs, and they can take it out or remove it. And then this is kind of using the closing statement too. This gets cropped in as a credit, your due diligence and earnest money, and then everything else is what's left.
Right.
You have this much money to bring the closing.
Of course. Jody made a
Of course you
fantastic
did.
Excel sheet.
But
And
it's what makes sense to me.
would you care to share that with everyone? Sure. So, there you go. Like, you cannot inform your buyers enough, or your seller, and you need to read the contract. So these addendums that you get, and maybe as the seller, your seller is perfectly okay with the scenario of, look, if it appraises too low and you don't want to sell the house, don't you think it would be fair to give some of that money back to the buyer, right? Do you really want to cripple them from their ability to buy a house at all? And if they're like, well, I took my house off the market and I need this money because I need to go buy another house, then fine, you've had the conversation, you don't agree to that part of the addendum or whatever. But go ahead and explain it all to them. And if they say, all right, well, can we split that? Then it's in the negotiation, 5,000 due diligence, 5,000 of earnest money, and then take the earnest money out so that they don't get both back. Try to make it fair. The whole due diligence was, you'll find most states, if you move and sell real estate somewhere else, they don't have due diligence. And that was part of the buyer's issue here. She's like, well, in Virginia, due diligence and earnest money are the same thing. I'm like, well, you're not in Virginia anymore, Dorothy. So that you've got to explain. And the whole point of it was, before there was due diligence money, earnest money, according to your VA buyer, right? It gets, if the buyer can't buy the house, it gets returned to them. And what would happen is buyers would go buy another truck or something the day before closing, and they no longer can buy the house. And they've had the house off the market for 6 weeks, and the seller had no recourse, nothing. So the idea was to even the playing field. Now it is swung over that the seller, the buyer's taking all this risk. So, and that's just a consequence of our market at the time, right now. But it is turning a little bit. So again, make sure, and whoever you're doing, protect them and educate them and ask them, is this what you want to do to somebody? Do you want, do you need all 10,000 or 5,000 be enough? Because you're gonna put your house back on the market and get it under contract again, So Heather had one, the buyer decided to walk away the day before closing, walked away from $12,000. How much? 13, knowingly, right? Because it made sense to him. He was gonna make more money in Raleigh. He's like, he should have figured that out ahead of time, but whatever.
And I did exactly what Trisha said to do, as the buyer's agent, I talked to the listing agent and, asked for it back. Did what I could to say, hey, if I give you the appraisal, would that be something that they in turn would then give something back? Do everything that you can on whichever hat you're wearing. The seller didn't agree to it. They didn't have to.
Because this guy, it was like the day before closing, it was like right at the last minute, so really make your other side. But here's the thing, the seller walked away with $13,000 for that month. Were they harmed?
Under contract.
Yeah, were they really harmed? Probably not, but it could, it could have ruined their ability to buy another house, So you never really know, but you just have to read it, discuss it, do what your client wants to do. Even if it's not what you would want them to do, if they want that, whatever, to keep 20,000 due diligence, you are working for them. So you've got to say, okay, that's fine. If your buyer wants to put 20,000 in due diligence and you have explained to them, if you're basically buying this house as is, right? Anything I think over $2,000, your buyer is now buying this house as is, because the seller's like, I could keep that 2,000. I'll keep that due diligence money if they walk away. So you explain that to your buyer, make that very, very clear. And if the seller, I've done the CMA and I'm not sure this is gonna appraise, if they decide, if it doesn't appraise, the whole contract opens back up, they're not in breach to say, I'm not selling the house, right? So you've got to tell everybody that. Everybody needs to know.
And that buyer was upset at the situation. Of course, it's $13,000, but there was at no point in time that he was mad at me, because one, we wrote it almost 20 grand over and it appraised. Two, so he knew I had done my job as far as giving him prompts and making it happen that way. Two, not only was there verbal confirmation that you do not get your due diligence back in any way whatsoever, there was text messages, it was all in conversation, then sending an email to say, hey, just wanted to recap from our conversations as getting ready. Please understand, any money that you put in due diligence, you will not get back if you terminate at any point in time. So guys, make sure that you're having all of that, because anything you can refer back to is going to be just that extra cushion on your tush when crap happens like that, because that was a lot of money.
Yeah, and here's the thing, people forget, right? And they selectively forget and they genuinely forget, right? So you can't cover yourself enough on this, because I don't care if it's your sister, when it comes to money, people go squirrely, and get, oh, my friend wouldn't do that. Yes, they would.
Hey, Trisha.
Hey, Scott.
So I actually had something, I did it, you learned from it. Not all states actually have due diligence money.
Not who, what?
Not all states actually do due diligence money.
Most do not.
So when you have out of town buyers coming in, it's definitely something to make sure you reiterate constantly, because I had a buyer freak out because he didn't realize it, even though we had multiple discussions, multiples of conversations through email, text message, and even sent him document pictures of the OTP and everything showing that the due diligence money is not earnest money.
So, yeah, I mean, you cannot, like the example I gave of the girl from Virginia, she thought due diligence and earnest money were the same thing, and that she would get it back. You do not, and it is your job to explain to them. So you'll get this, well, the last house I sold, this didn't happen. Well, the last house I sold, I got money at closing, you know, well, you explain to them like, look, every state has different laws and every market is very different. And our market in Fayetteville is significantly different than the market in Raleigh. So real estate is a very hyper-local thing. And I need you to understand this contract, this area, and what you're putting yourself out to. So what happened, Scott? Did your buyer lose his due diligence money?
Well, no, we ended up making a deal with repairs, but he did threaten lawyers and suing all over the due diligence money, even though I had proof and evidence that we had talked about it. We even sent him pictures of the contracts because he was coming from Kansas, and I guess Kansas doesn't have it.
Yeah, probably don't. Majority.
And I'm trying to explain that, like, different states, different rules, different laws.
Uh-huh.
And he was consulting a lawyer from Kansas
Yeah.
that had no idea. He wasn't licensed in North Carolina.
Yeah. So what he was at CGSC with some JAG attorneys, and they're all sitting around like, you know, oh, we know. Yeah, you know.
But we ended up making it to closing. It's just, we had to pay for something. We had to pay for some repairs because nobody refused to pay for it.
Agreed to pay for it.
Yeah.
So how much due diligence was there?
$7,000.
Mm-hmm. So again, anything over 2, your buyer is saying, I'm taking this house as is. Because sellers right now have become the most greedy individuals you have ever met in your life. 2 years ago, they were bringing money to closing, paying bonuses, doing every repair, and bringing thousands to close the house. Now they're like, oh, you want me to screw in that outlet? No, not doing it, you know?
But I think a lot of that also comes from setting the tone at the listing agreement.
True.
And also buyers being really ridiculous about what they're doing. Because if your neighbor has it listed at 100 and sells it at 130, if the buyer came and said, well, I'll pay $30,000 more. Yeah, so there is greed, but there's also, I mean, I'm not gonna look at, if I'm a seller, I'm not gonna look at, well, I'm gonna take $3,000 less if this person over here is willing to give it. So
Yeah, so is it greed or is it opportunity?
I think it's opportunity.
You know, or is it both?
It could be
You
both.
know, but I had one.
That we as listing agents need to make sure that we're setting the expectations that, listen, stays down into your safety issues, plumbing. those
Or
are
something
things-
that you think is gonna come up on a VA appraisal.
Yes, those are things that we need to be setting the expectation for.
Yeah, no, I agree. I had one where, he was my minister. I have a theory about that, but I won't share that.
I know that theory.
Oh, my goodness. Now, he was making $40-some thousand on this house and would not do a repair. I mean, nothing. And I was like, come on. If you're the buyer, what would you want? You know? Nope. Nope. And it was $6,000 of due diligence. So the buyer, like, what, it wasn't $6,000 worth of repairs. There were repairs that, you know, I don't remember what they were at that point, but I remember thinking, that's a logical request.
Do you tell him that you recommend he does it, or do you just
I said, listen,
suggest?
I think it's a good idea. However, you are not obligated because you have got to you're working for that seller,
Right.
right? So you have to tell them legally, you're not obligated to do that. You don't have to do it. They're asking for you, you know, they've given you above asking price. They've given you $6,000 of due diligence. a closing date that you're happy with, they're asking for these few things. You don't have to do it. Are you gonna do it? Nope.
Well, and like I have one right now, and I don't like to budge.
Oh, listen,
There's a septic and one distribution line is not working for 30. And I'm like, we need to do that. And she's like, and I'm like, okay, but if it goes back on the market, we now have to tell everybody about that. And she's like, okay.
Yeah.
Like she doesn't care.
Yeah.
And I don't
so I know, and what can you do? You work for her.
Mhm.
So, and I would say, be careful, don't say, we need to fix that.
Sorry. Yeah, I mean, I have to disclose what the
Yeah.
material.
You would
fact
say,
part of
like,
this number.
well, my client,
Mhm.
don't put yourself in the contract,
Yeah.
because then you get too emotionally involved in it, and they're paying you not to be. So don't put yourself in. It's not we are doing this. We didn't accept that. We didn't say no to that. My client did.
Or she might, if I say we, she might be like, okay.
Right, exactly. Well, I had one where the buyer, so $550,000 house, they're paying cash for it. And they're like, the agent was like, well, we don't this, we don't this, and we don't that. I said, oh, I'm sorry, did I miss it that you were on the contract? You mind this house? Well, no. I said, oh, okay. And then he said, well, we don't think the price is right. I said, oh, you're an appraiser too. I didn't know. That ended that. So I would just say, be careful. Don't put yourself in it. You're not in the contract. You're not part of that decision. You are the third-party professional who is helping them make a decision. You're giving them the facts, and you're not personally involved. We. You're not paying it. They're paying you. So don't say we did this and we did this and we're not doing anything else, because it's not you. Any questions? Anyone?
I just wanted to review again the appraisal addendum real quick. I just want to make sure.
Which one?
The first and the second one. So you showed the first one and you were the one that said, pay attention because due diligence is written second.
Uh-huh.
So that's what I'm going to use when I have a buyer.
So when it's the return, it doesn't matter where it is. So what you need to look at, Vicky, is on number 3, the buyer shall not incur any penalty. That's what you're using when you have a buyer that you want to make sure their due diligence money comes back to them and their earnest money.
Okay.
And be clear too, this is only coming into effect when the appraisal comes back at a price other than the agreed upon contract price. The seller, this does not give the seller the right to just like, I'm gonna terminate. A seller, it's very, very, very difficult for a seller to terminate. Just know that. But when the appraisal comes back and the price is not the price that everyone agreed upon, then the whole contract comes up, and this is where this comes into effect. Are you clear on that?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, but does that clear on your other one? The other one just doesn't have that there. The buyer,
Are
it's,
they the same thing? Should we?
one says shall not be entitled to the return, one says will.
You need to read them very closely because we have those. And then you have other companies that have had their attorneys write them.
Right.
And all of that, so you need to read them very carefully because the nots or the will or the shall may be in different places and it may not look just like this one. So you have to read it every word and read it 10 times over and have someone else read it and then.
See, because this says should not be entitled to the return of it. And this one says shall not incur any penalty, which means they will be entitled, it will be returned. You've got to read it. You've got to read it. And you're responsible for reading it, for making sure your people are clear on it. So if you wrote something for a buyer and you're not doing an appraisal contingency, and there's a $5,000 due diligence and a $5,000 earnest money, and then the appraisal comes back low, and the seller says, I'm not selling the house, what is your buyer getting back?
Earnest money for sure.
Just earnest money, not due diligence. So that's the whole point of the class, to make sure you're clear on that. If you are in a negotiation and you don't know, and you get an appraisal, a addendum back from another company and you're not clear about it, send it to myself or Renee or an ALC member, have somebody read it and explain it. You never want your people to sign something that you're not clear on. All right, because you are there to protect their money. Anybody else? Is that clear, Vicki? You good?
Absolutely. Thank you.
You're very welcome. No good? All right, so I think we're done.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Thanks, Tricia.